I have a BS in computer science. I graduated in 1986. Got my first job that year and learned SAS at that university job. A couple of years later, I moved on to a government research job. In 1989, I attended my first SAS User Group International Conference. That's SUGI 14 in San Francisco. 1996, I finally got around to putting together some papers, 3 papers at CSUG. In the spring of 1997, I began contributing to SAS-L. That was my contribution where I started working with my peers to learn SAS. I had been reading SAS-L for since I came to CDC. In 2001, I was recognized as most valuable contributor to SAS-L. In 2007, I began contributing to the SAS community organization, Wikipedia. 2012, I retired, and I've been writing a couple of papers since. In this year, 2017, I published my 40th paper. Okay, I have a half a dozen rules. I'm not sure, since you're going to edit it, then you can work around that. The Pareto rule, the 80%, 20% rule, is very important to me. I have a little bit of knowledge of quality assurance. I think it's very important for programmers to have a style guide. And I've studied over the years through reading papers at SAS conferences, database design. There was a big push to learn SQL in 2000, 2001. And the last couple of years, I've gotten good at using my operating system, which I consider very important. Bricolage, creative tinkering, that's where my contributions to SAS-L, thinking through problems, that's become very important to me. I recommend keeping a daily job diary, which I'll get to in a minute, and I have a paradigm list processing, which has helped me in my overview of programming. So I have pretty much a page on each one of these items, if I can separate my pages here. I was surprised to see early on that I spent 80% of my time cleaning my data. I like this 80%, 20%. They're big numbers. You got 20, 40, 60, 80, and 20, so you can remember that. Programs, for me, consist of 20% data structure and 80% of algorithm. Whenever I look at my daily job diary, I see that I spend 80% of my time fixing that small piece, the 20% that is data structure. I spend a lot of time after I write a program and doing the test programs and the documentation, which I think is very important. I learned a little bit about quality assurance. My most important guy is Phil Crosby. He's the author of the Zero Defects idea. That's my standard in writing a program, is to make sure that it runs through all the unit tests and the integration tests. There are several other people. Pareto, I've already mentioned. We have a shoe art procedure. You need to know who Deming and Duran were. Six Sigma, and total quality management. All these things contribute to my understanding of what it takes to write a program that is reusable, which is one of my keywords. That's why I'm called a macro maven, is that I want to write reusable programs. The most important thing for me as a programmer is to have a style guide. The two most important aspects of that style guide for me are the naming conventions. I find every time that I have not paid attention to naming conventions at the beginning of a project, that it involves a lot of rework when I finally decide what the naming conventions are. I have to go back and rename variables or data sets, things like that. And the second aspect of the style guide is white space. Um, Indentation so that it's easy to read, not only read, but search and find what you're looking for when you go back to fix a program is one of the things that I emphasize in my style guide. There are many other aspects of that, but I'll skip them. My knowledge of database design, very important to me to understand when I think about a problem, what is my data supposed to be doing in terms of the larger project. You know, there are five types of database tables. We have lookup tables, we have transaction tables, we have inventories. That's why we call our data sets observations, because they're actually inventories. They're a snapshot, you know, looking and recording of an event. I said earlier that learning SQL was very important for me. There are two aspects that people that know SQL when they come into SAS don't realize, and that is the SQL dictionaries and the interface to the macro language with the select into macro variable. These things really put me, it was a very important piece for me to learn the SQL select into. I wrote a good hands-on workshop about that. Once I started looking into the Windows operating system, it made a lot more sense to me to get familiar with the startup process of SAS. That includes two very important things. One is the configuration files that SAS uses, and also the user customizable Autoexec. So my knowledge of the operating system, it's very important to understand the SAS configuration files and the user written Autoexec. I wrote a paper about an Autoexec companion a couple of years ago, which covered all the things that you need to know in order to set up access to your reusable programs and macros that you've written. Batch processing is very important when you understand how to use your operating system, and so I rely on the discipline of test-driven development. So I can't do that unless I'm running my programs in batch. Many people ask me why I don't open up SAS and use the editor. I have a professional text editor, and running the program, the editor opens up the log for me and refreshes it. So I only open up SAS to look at the actual SAS session. I don't know, maybe once a month if I need something quick that I don't want to write a small program for. Bricolage, creative tinkering. I would like to work for that great search engine in the sky and spend 20% of my time doing a self-education and also taking the time to share that with my peers. So I've gone back and forth on SASL, SAS Community, and the communities on SAS, sharing the knowledge that I've learned in my own self-education. I keep a daily job diary. This is much more important to me now that I'm retired. I wish I had spent more time while I was actually working doing this, because it would have been useful in my performance reviews. You know, what were you doing for that week? Well, I was running 1,000 reports for you. You need to get good at estimating task time, and your daily job diary is one way to see how much time you spend programming versus attending meetings or writing reports. And for me now, it helps me stay focused. You know, if I get stuck on a problem and I look at my daily job diary, it's like, oh, you spent an hour on this, time to move on. I've spent a lot of time since I wrote a paper with Art Carpenter called List Processing Basics. I think this was 2007, 2008, developing the concept of list processing. And out of that, I've come away with two other ideas. The first is cardinality ratio, and the second, which I laid out in the Seaside paper this last month, is the cardinality types. There are few and many and unique. Variables that have unique values, variables that have many values, those are your analysis variables, and variables that have few values, those are your lookup, your categorical variables. So once I know this about a data set, the work of programming, I have my bivariables, I have my analysis variables. When I want to clean the data, I know what the identifiers of the data set are. It goes much faster. I kind of laid them out, and I want to differentiate between a process and a procedure. I think your original question was, which procedures do I use? And I have a process which I run all the time. My Autoexec, that's the most important thing to me, since I have a library which I have to tell SAS where the folder is that contains all the reusable programs and macros that I have. So Autoexec is my first process. I run that every time I run a batch program. My screen name is the Macro Maven, so I have an interest in the macro language. I've been writing macros since the first year that I learned SAS, and that's now 30 years ago. In the last decade, I've come to know the sys macro function, and just in the last couple of years, learned the SCL. I think that's screen control language or source control language. Functions that I can use in the macro language. So now I'm writing macros which return only macro code. They don't write SAS code. So that's an interesting aspect to me to rise up to this level of writing in the macro language that only writes other macro statements. And so I've given up on SAS. I'm just writing in the SAS macro language. PROC Content, as I said earlier, data structure is the key for me when I write a program. When I get the data structure straight, everything flows after that. SQL has a describe table thing, which allows me to write the data structure into my log. The SQL dictionaries, that's sliced bread. It really is. And when you understand how much information you can get out of the SQL dictionaries, it really rocks your boat. The access into the SQL access into the macro language, the select into macro variable, very powerful. But also can be misused. There are a couple of tricks there that, if you're not aware of them, you use them on big data sets, you'll learn how to explode SAS. Frequency and summary, those are the other two procedures that when I do write SAS code, those are the main procedures that I use. Okay, so the main function of SAS macros, everybody believes, is to write SAS code. So the first thing that you need to be good at in writing a macro is to be able to have working SAS code that you want your macro to write. A lot of people, when they begin to learn macro, are confused. They're thinking that they're writing SAS, well, they're writing macro code, they're writing SAS code, and they go back and forth. So the confusion is, I am exactly doing one task, and that is writing SAS code with the macro language. Like any language, it has its strengths. It has access to variables that are local and global. It has access to all the system allocated constants. Most people don't know that because they haven't studied their configuration file. So to be a good macro programmer, you need to know your assets. I tell people that macros occur in 3 places within the program. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the 2 other places. You store that in the folder that you're writing your project, or you store it in another folder which is available to all your projects. That's why I said earlier about the Autoexec. I've set up my Autoexec for every project has access to my centralized macro and other programs folders.